Maria had been a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital for almost 5 years, but nothing in her career could have prepared her for the patient she was about to meet. It was early morning when she first heard about the new admission. A man found in a car accident. He was unconscious, in a coma, and his name was Alexander Blackwell, a billionaire whose reputation preceded him. She had never seen such a famous man in the hospital before, but she knew his name from the business magazines she occasionally skimmed through. As Maria entered room 302 for her shift, she couldn't help but notice how different this patient felt compared to others. The room was pristine, with rich, dark wood furniture and expensive-looking medical equipment. His personal items, including a suitcase and briefcase, lay neatly by his bedside. She glanced at the man lying still in the bed. He appeared calm, his breathing steady, but there was something haunting about his stillness. The air in the room felt thick, heavy even. Her job was clear: monitor his vitals, adjust his IVs, and make sure everything was running smoothly. But as she took her place beside him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He had the look of someone who was very used to being in control, yet here he was, vulnerable and unaware of his surroundings. Maria had dealt with wealthy patients before, but they always had family around or assistants calling in to check on them. Yet Mr. Blackwell's room was strangely empty. No one came to visit, and no one had even called in to ask about his condition. She found this odd, but dismissed it at first. After all, the man was in a coma. Maybe he just didn't have anyone close, or maybe his family was busy with business matters. Who could say? Still, as Maria continued her work, she couldn't stop looking at him. His face was sharp, well-groomed, the kind of man who seemed to have everything in the world. He wore an expensive suit, which was now covered by a hospital gown, but the way he held himself, even in his unconscious state, made Maria wonder about his life. How did someone like him end up in a coma, all alone? Her curiosity grew when she glanced at the briefcase resting at the foot of his bed. It was locked, and the small key that usually accompanied it was nowhere to be seen. She told herself it wasn't her business, but she couldn't help but wonder what could be inside. Was it just paperwork? Or perhaps something more personal? Something important that could explain this man's strange situation. While Maria adjusted the settings on the machine monitoring his brain activity, her mind wandered. She thought about how it was strange that no one had checked in on him, especially given his wealth and status. She had seen a few high-profile patients during her career, and they always had a stream of visitors or family members. Yet here he was, with no one by his side, no family asking for updates. It didn't feel right. The only visitors to his room were nurses and doctors, and even then, they kept their distance. Maria noticed that the staff, although polite, didn't speak much about Mr. Blackwell. It was as if they were afraid to say anything. There were whispers behind closed doors, but no one would give her any answers. Something felt off. Maria had worked in the hospital long enough to recognize when there was a strange energy in the air. She had seen many patients in her time, young and old, rich and poor, but this felt different. There was an aura around Mr. Blackwell that she couldn't explain. The next few days passed without much change. Maria continued to care for him, checking his vitals, adjusting his IVs, and making sure his condition didn't worsen. Yet she couldn't help but feel more and more drawn to him. It wasn't just his wealth or the mystery surrounding him. It was something about his presence, even in a coma, that kept her thinking about him long after her shift ended. One day, as she was cleaning his room, she noticed something out of the ordinary. There was a small envelope tucked into the corner of his suitcase. It was carefully hidden, almost as if someone didn't want it found. Her heart raced as she picked it up. It wasn't sealed, but it was addressed to Mr. A. Blackwell, with no other details. Maria hesitated. It wasn't her place to go through his things. She was a nurse, not a detective. But the curiosity was overwhelming. Maria opened the envelope carefully. Inside, there was a letter, handwritten, and in perfect handwriting. She couldn't help but read the first few lines. The letter mentioned something about keeping a secret at all costs, but before she could read more, the door to the room opened, and a doctor stepped in. Maria quickly folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope, hiding it once again in the suitcase. She hadn't finished reading it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was written there had something to do with Mr. Blackwell's current state. As the doctor went about his routine checkup, Maria's thoughts were still racing. Who was this man, really? And why was he alone? What was the secret he was hiding? For now, all Maria could do was wait. But she knew one thing for sure. Her ordinary shift had just turned into something much more complicated than she had ever expected. Maria's mind was racing after the strange encounter with the letter. Her shift had ended, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been hidden from her. The contents of the envelope had been on the edge of her thoughts all day, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop wondering what it had said, who had written it, and what kind of secret could it be. Her curiosity gnawed at her, and by the time her next shift arrived, she was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. As she entered room 302, everything seemed normal. Too normal. Mr. Blackwell still lay in his coma, his body still and unmoving. His vitals were steady on the monitor, and the machines hummed softly around him. But Maria couldn't help but feel that the room was hiding something, a secret just waiting to be discovered. After a quick glance at the clock, Maria knew she had a little time before her duties would begin. The other nurses were busy with their rounds, and she was alone with Mr. Blackwell. This was her chance. She moved to the foot of the bed, where his suitcase rested. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she bent down and carefully unzipped the bag. She had no idea what she was looking for, but her instincts told her to be cautious. As she rummaged through the contents, her fingers brushed against something solid, a small, hidden compartment in the bottom of the suitcase. Her breath caught in her throat. Maria's hands shook slightly as she opened the compartment, revealing a folder. It wasn't just any folder. It looked expensive, the kind of thing a person would use to keep important papers or documents. She pulled it out and flipped it open, scanning the pages inside. What she found stunned her. The first page contained a list of names, all with blacked-out details. Each name had a line of numbers next to it, numbers that looked like account numbers or coded references. There were more pages, each one more cryptic than the last. Maria could feel her pulse quicken as she realized this wasn't just some random paperwork. These were details about powerful people, people who were connected to Mr. Blackwell in some way. There was a section at the back of the folder that made Maria's stomach drop. It contained a series of photographs, grainy, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking it. The images showed Mr. Blackwell meeting with several well-known politicians and business leaders. They were in private settings, their faces barely visible in the low light. But the thing that caught Maria's attention most was the man standing next to Blackwell in one of the photos. The man had his back to the camera, but Maria could see his face clearly enough. He looked familiar. She had seen his face on TV before. The name hit her like a lightning bolt. Samuel Reed, the infamous international businessman with a reputation for illegal activities. The photo was old, but it didn't take much to connect the dots. Maria's hands trembled as she closed the folder. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to find a trail of secrets so deep and tangled. Mr. Blackwell wasn't just a billionaire. He was tied to powerful, dangerous people, and it seemed that his coma wasn't as simple as it appeared. But the mystery only deepened. Why would Mr. Blackwell be in a coma? And what did he have to do with Samuel Reed and the others in those photographs? Before Maria could think further, she heard footsteps coming down the hall. Her heart raced as she quickly shoved the folder back into the hidden compartment and zipped up the suitcase. She had to act fast. She turned and made her way back to the other side of the room, pretending to adjust the medical equipment as the door opened. It was Dr. Lawrence, the head doctor on Mr. Blackwell's case. He walked in without saying a word, checking the monitors and writing something down in his chart. Maria forced herself to remain calm, But she couldn't stop the thoughts swirling in her mind. Did Dr. Lawrence know what she had just discovered? Was he involved in this somehow? For the rest of the shift, Maria did her best to keep her focus on her duties. She checked Mr. Blackwell's vitals, adjusted his IV, and tried to maintain her composure. But all she could think about was what she had uncovered. The folder, the photos, the connections, it was all starting to form a dangerous puzzle, and Maria didn't know if she was ready to solve it. As the day came to a close, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her every move felt under scrutiny. She had uncovered something big, and now the question was whether or not she could trust anyone in this hospital. Was Dr. Lawrence hiding something? Or was there a larger force at play, keeping Mr. Blackwell's secrets hidden? As she left the hospital at the end of her shift, Maria knew that her involvement with Mr. Blackwell wasn't over. The mystery was only beginning, and she was right in the middle of it. What would she discover next? And who could she trust? Maria's mind raced as she walked out into the night, the weight of the secret she had uncovered already beginning to sink in. There was no turning back now. She had to find out the truth. Maria's mind was racing as she left the hospital that night. The images of Mr. Blackwell's secret files and the connections to powerful figures kept replaying in her head. The more she thought about it, the more questions arose. Who was Mr. Blackwell really? And why had he been hiding all of this? The answers were elusive, but Maria was determined to uncover the truth. The next morning, Maria found herself standing outside the hospital, staring at the familiar building. But today, everything felt different. She had uncovered something no one else seemed to know, and the weight of it hung heavy on her shoulders. She knew she couldn't just go back to her regular routine and pretend like nothing had happened. But what could she do? She couldn't just walk into Dr. Lawrence's office and ask about the secret documents. He'd probably know she had discovered something, and she had no idea what kind of reaction she might get. So, she decided to keep her distance, for now. Instead, Maria made her way to the hospital's cafeteria, hoping to clear her head. As she sat down with her coffee, her mind kept returning to the man in the photographs, Samuel Reed. The fact that Mr. Blackwell had been connected to someone like Reed was enough to send a chill down her spine. Reed was notorious for his illegal business dealings and rumored connections to criminal organizations. If Blackwell had been involved with him, it meant Maria was in much deeper than she had ever anticipated. But why was Blackwell in a coma? Was it related to Reed? Or was it something else entirely? Maria needed answers, and she knew where to look. The hospital's records. She had access to a lot of files, but she'd never used them for anything other than her day-to-day responsibilities. Today, though, was different. If she was going to uncover the truth, she had to take a risk. She had to find out everything she could about Mr. Blackwell's condition. By the time her shift started, Maria had made up her mind. She would go to the hospital's record room after hours and search for anything that might explain Mr. Blackwell's coma. She was well aware of the risks, but she couldn't stop now. Her curiosity had already led her this far. As the day went on, Maria's mind was constantly distracted. She couldn't focus on her patients, and the other nurses began to notice. "Maria, you okay?" one of her colleagues, Jessica, asked during a break. Maria forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired," she lied. "Long night." Jessica nodded but didn't seem convinced. "You're usually more focused. If you need to talk about anything, you know I'm here." Maria appreciated the concern, but she couldn't share what was really on her mind. This was something she had to figure out on her own. Finally, as the evening shift came to an end, Maria found herself walking down the familiar hallways of the hospital, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. She felt a knot in her stomach. This wasn't just a routine visit to the records room. She was diving headfirst into something dangerous, and she wasn't sure if she could handle what she might find. The hospital's record room was located in a back hallway, hidden behind a set of double doors. Maria had been there a few times to update patient files, but tonight it felt different. She checked the hallway carefully to make sure no one was around, then slipped into the room. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, each one packed with documents. Maria knew exactly where to look. She made her way to the section labeled high-profile cases and began to search through the files. She pulled out Mr. Blackwell's file, but when she opened it, she found nothing that explained his coma. There were medical reports, but they were vague, offering no real explanation for what had happened to him. There were no details about any accidents or health problems that could have led to his condition. Frustrated, Maria went through the rest of the documents in the file. Finally, near the bottom, she found something. A small note. It was handwritten and folded in half. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she carefully unfolded it. The note was brief, but its contents sent a shiver down her spine. It simply read, "He knows too much. Take care of him before it's too late." Maria's blood ran cold. She stared at the note, her mind spinning. The words seemed to confirm everything she had feared. Mr. Blackwell's coma wasn't just a medical issue. It was part of something much larger, something dangerous. Someone wanted him silenced. But who? And why? Before Maria could process the information, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. She quickly shoved the note back into the file and slid it back into the cabinet, her heart pounding. She couldn't get caught here. If anyone found her in the records room, it would raise too many questions. She hurried out of the room and back into the main hallway, her mind racing. The note confirmed her suspicions. Mr. Blackwell wasn't just a victim of an accident or a random illness. He had been targeted. And now Maria was tangled up in something much bigger than she had ever expected. As she walked to the elevator, she couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. Someone out there knew what she had found, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The deeper Maria dug into the mystery, the more dangerous it became. And with each new discovery, she realized that her life was in more danger than ever before. Maria could barely sleep that night. The note she had found in Mr. Blackwell's file echoed in her mind. The words, "He knows too much. Take care of him before it's too late." She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that her discovery had triggered something far larger than she had ever imagined. Her life was no longer just about caring for patients. It was about uncovering a web of secrets that could change everything. The next morning, Maria tried to focus on her work, but every patient she cared for felt like a distraction from the storm brewing in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Blackwell. She had to know who wanted him silenced, and why. During her lunch break, Maria decided to call her best friend Sarah. Sarah was a journalist and had helped Maria out of tough situations before. If anyone could help her make sense of what was going on, it was Sarah. "Hello." Sarah answered on the third ring. "Sarah, it's Maria," she said, her voice tense. "I need your help. There's something I found that I don't understand, and it's got me worried." There was a pause on the other end. "What's going on?" Maria took a deep breath. "It's about a patient I've been caring for, Mr. Blackwell. He's a billionaire, and I think someone's trying to kill him. I found a note in his file, and it's like a warning. I don't know what to do with it, but I need to know more. Can you help me figure out what's really going on?" Sarah was quiet for a moment before speaking. "This sounds serious, Maria. If what you're saying is true, you might be in danger too. I can look into it, but you need to be careful. Promise me you won't do anything risky." "I promise," Maria replied, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. This was already too deep, and she couldn't turn back now. After their conversation, Maria felt a small sense of relief. Sarah would look into it, and maybe together, they could get to the bottom of the mystery. But deep down, Maria knew time was running out. Whoever wanted Mr. Blackwell silenced wouldn't stop just because she had a friend looking into it. That afternoon, Maria returned to her shift at the hospital, trying to appear calm, even though her heart was racing. She knew she had to continue her work, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching her. The hallways of the hospital, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed eerie and full of hidden dangers. As she entered the ICU, she was greeted by a nurse named Ethan. "Hey, Maria, we've got a new case coming in. You might want to prepare for it," he said, handing her a clipboard with details about a new patient. Maria took the clipboard, but her mind was still on Mr. Blackwell. She knew she had to visit him again. Something told her that he knew more than he had let on, and if she could just get him to wake up, maybe he could answer some of her questions. That evening, after her shift had ended, Maria found herself back in the ICU. The lights were dim, and the hallway was quiet. She walked past several rooms, her footsteps echoing off the walls, until she reached Mr. Blackwell's room. She paused for a moment, staring through the glass. He was still unconscious, hooked up to machines, but there was something different about him. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like he was somehow aware of her presence. Taking a deep breath, Maria entered the room and approached his bed. She noticed the small, faint change in his expression, like he was beginning to stir. Maria sat down beside him, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the bed. She hadn't expected him to wake up, but she couldn't help herself. The mystery was consuming her. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise. It was a soft groan, followed by a weak whisper. Maria leaned in closer, her heart pounding. "Mr. Blackwell," she whispered, hoping he could hear her. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he just stared at her. Then, in a raspy voice, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here. They'll come for you. You need to leave." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She leaned forward, desperate to hear more. "Who will come for me? What do you know? Please, Mr. Blackwell, tell me everything." But before he could respond, the door to the room swung open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Dr. Lawrence, the head of the ICU, and his eyes instantly locked onto Maria. "What are you doing here, Maria?" he asked, his voice cold and stern. Maria quickly pulled back from the bed, her heart racing. I was just talking to Mr. Blackwell." Dr. Lawrence didn't respond. He walked into the room, his gaze shifting from Maria to the patient in the bed. "It's not safe for you to be here, Maria. Mr. Blackwell needs rest. You should go home." Maria hesitated, but something in his tone made her feel uneasy. She nodded, not wanting to push him further, but her mind was reeling. What had Mr. Blackwell been trying to say? What danger was he warning her about? As she walked out of the room, she glanced back at the bed, but Mr. Blackwell had already closed his eyes again. His warning echoed in her mind. "They'll come for you." Maria's fear intensified. Who was coming for her? Why was Dr. Lawrence so concerned? The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture was far from clear. Maria had uncovered a dangerous secret, and now she had to find out just how far the web of lies reached, before it was too late. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The warning Mr. Blackwell had whispered to her, "They'll come for you," echoed in her mind, growing louder with each passing minute. She had left the hospital that night with more questions than answers. Her steps felt heavier, like she was being drawn into a dangerous game she didn't fully understand. She had tried to go home and rest, but sleep never came. The unsettling thought of Mr. Blackwell's cryptic message kept her awake, circling her thoughts. What had he meant? Who was he warning her about? Dr. Lawrence's sudden appearance in Mr. Blackwell's room didn't sit right with her either. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The next morning, Maria returned to the hospital, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let fear stop her from uncovering the truth. Whatever secret Mr. Blackwell was hiding, she needed to find out before it was too late. As she walked through the hospital's sterile halls, she could feel the tension building inside her. There was no turning back now. When she arrived at the ICU, she quickly checked in with the nurses at the desk. They greeted her with their usual professionalism, but she noticed the way their eyes lingered on her. Had they noticed her strange behavior last night? Did they know what had happened between her and Mr. Blackwell? She tried to push the thought away. Focus, she told herself. She had to stay focused on the mission. Mr. Blackwell was the key to everything. Maria made her way to his room, her heart pounding in her chest. She was determined to get some answers, but as she approached the door, she noticed something strange. The door to Mr. Blackwell's room was slightly ajar. It was never left open, not since the accident that had put him in a coma. Maria hesitated, but then curiosity got the best of her. She pushed the door open slowly, her eyes scanning the room. Inside, the room was eerily quiet, but something was off. The bed was empty. Her pulse quickened. Where was he? Maria stepped further into the room, her eyes darting around. The machines were still beeping quietly, but there was no sign of Mr. Blackwell. The sheets were rumpled, but the bed was clearly unoccupied. She looked toward the window, wondering if perhaps he had been moved to another room. But as her gaze swept the room, something caught her attention. On the floor, just beside the bedside table, was a small envelope. It was tucked underneath a stack of papers, almost as if someone had left it there deliberately. Maria's fingers trembled as she picked it up. She tore it open with quick, practiced movements, her mind racing. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only one sentence written on it, in a sharp, elegant script. "You should not have come. Leave now, or you'll regret it." Her stomach dropped. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was crystal clear. Whoever was behind this didn't want her involved. They wanted her to back off. But Maria wasn't the type to back down. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket, determination flooding through her veins. She was already too deep into this, and there was no turning back now. The stakes had risen, and Maria knew it. Someone didn't want her digging any deeper into Mr. Blackwell's past. Just then, she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly tucked herself behind the curtain, her breath coming in sharp, anxious bursts. She couldn't afford to be caught in the room. If they found her snooping around, she knew there would be consequences. The footsteps grew louder, and Maria's heart raced. She held her breath, waiting, her muscles tense with fear. The door opened, and Dr. Lawrence stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Maria stayed perfectly still, hoping he wouldn't notice her hiding behind the curtain. He was muttering to himself, his hands adjusting the machines and checking Mr. Blackwell's charts. For a brief moment, he seemed completely unaware of her presence. But then he stopped. His gaze drifted toward the empty bed, and his lips tightened. He looked at the floor, his eyes falling on the envelope that Maria had just discovered. He bent down, picking it up without a word, and slipped it into his pocket as though it had never been there. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. Dr. Lawrence knew something he wasn't telling her. What was going on here? Who was he working for? And what did Mr. Blackwell know that was so dangerous? She had to find out. As Dr. Lawrence left the room, Maria waited a few moments before she emerged from her hiding place. The room was still, the faint hum of the machines filling the silence. She had to get to the bottom of this. And fast. Whoever was behind Mr. Blackwell's condition, and whoever was leaking these threats, wasn't going to stop anytime soon. The clock was ticking, and Maria knew the deeper she went, the more dangerous it would become. She had no choice. She had to follow this trail wherever it led, even if it meant uncovering secrets that could destroy everything she knew. Maria's mind raced as she left the hospital room, clutching the threatening note in her pocket. The faint buzzing of hospital equipment in the background did nothing to calm her nerves. Every step she took felt heavier, as though an invisible weight was bearing down on her. She had uncovered something far deeper than she had ever expected, and the danger now felt far too real. She couldn't trust anyone, not even Dr. Lawrence. His strange behavior, combined with his dismissive attitude the day before, suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. He had been at the hospital for as long as Maria could remember, but now she realized there was more to his role than simply being the head of the ICU. Something wasn't adding up. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, her thumb hovering over the screen. The last thing she needed was more cryptic messages, but she couldn't resist the urge to know. The text read, "Leave the hospital. It's too late for you to get out now." Her heart skipped a beat. Was this the same person who had left the note in Mr. Blackwell's room? Whoever it was, they knew exactly where she was. They had eyes everywhere. She could feel their presence, like shadows lurking in the corners, just out of sight. A chill ran down her spine. This was no longer just a job for Maria. It was a battle for survival. She quickly closed her phone and shoved it back in her bag, looking around the quiet hospital hallway. The dim fluorescent lights above buzzed, casting an eerie glow on the white walls. She had to get out, but something told her she couldn't leave just yet. The mystery was too big now, and she wasn't about to let fear control her actions. Maria hurried to the nurse's station, hoping to find a bit of clarity, some small detail that might help her piece this puzzle together. Her eyes scanned the familiar faces, but they all seemed just as ordinary as ever. The same nurses, the same doctors. No one seemed out of place. She needed answers. One of the nurses, Alina, noticed her standing there and smiled warmly. Maria returned a tight smile, trying to maintain composure. Alina had always been kind, always willing to lend a hand, but Maria couldn't afford to trust anyone right now. "Hey, Alina," Maria said, her voice low, barely above a whisper. "Has anyone been in Mr. Blackwell's room recently?" Alina's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "No, Maria, not really. Just the usual checks, but no one's been in there much today. Why?" Maria leaned in closer, lowering her voice even more. "I think there's something going on with his case. I think someone's hiding something." Alina looked taken aback, but nodded slowly. "What do you mean?" Before Maria could respond, her phone buzzed again. She glanced down at it, her heart pounding. Another message. The same unknown number. "You're asking the wrong questions. You're not going to find the answers you want." Her pulse raced as she quickly silenced her phone. She couldn't afford to let it distract her. Her eyes darted back to Alina, who was still watching her curiously. Maria was about to say something more when the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. She quickly stepped back, instinctively drawing herself into the shadows of a nearby storage closet. Through the small crack in the door, Maria watched as Dr. Lawrence walked past, his face set in an emotionless mask. He had something clenched in his hand, something small and metallic. It was too far for Maria to see clearly, but it didn't matter. She was sure he wasn't just passing by. He was headed straight for Mr. Blackwell's room. Why? The question swirled in her mind. Was he trying to cover his tracks? Was there something he needed to hide? Maria's heart raced. She couldn't let him know she was onto him. She waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before emerging from the closet. She had to follow him. Maria took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had no choice but to dive deeper into the mystery. She had already seen too much to back out now, and whoever was behind this wasn't going to let her go easily. The web of deception was only growing, and Maria was caught right in the middle. She followed quietly, keeping a safe distance behind Dr. Lawrence. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. Dr. Lawrence had the answers, and she was going to find them. Her eyes never left him as he made his way down the hall, his pace quickening. He entered a service elevator, but not the one that led to the patient floors. This one was smaller, more discreet. It descended several floors below the ground level. Maria's breath caught in her throat. This was it. She had found the secret. The elevator doors closed behind him, and Maria didn't hesitate. She followed, slipping into the elevator just before it shut completely. She had no idea where it would lead, but she was willing to risk everything to get to the bottom of this. The doors closed, and as the elevator descended, Maria's pulse raced. The unknown awaited her, and she was ready to face whatever it was. The elevator descended deeper into the unknown, its quiet hum the only sound that filled the air. Maria's heart raced in her chest, and her breath felt shallow as she clutched her coat tightly, trying to steady herself. She had no idea what she was about to uncover, but there was no turning back now. She was already too far in, and the truth had become an obsession she couldn't ignore. When the elevator finally came to a stop, the doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a stark, sterile hallway. It was nothing like the patient floors she was used to. The air was colder here, the walls a dull gray, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Maria stepped out cautiously, scanning her surroundings. There were no signs, no nurses or staff, just silence. Dr. Lawrence's footsteps echoed down the hallway ahead, and Maria followed him, keeping her distance as he turned a corner. Her mind raced with questions. What was down here? Why had Dr. Lawrence come to this part of the hospital? It was clear he was hiding something, and Maria was determined to find out what. As she rounded the corner, she saw him enter a large locked door at the end of the hall. The door was unlike anything she'd seen before. It was solid steel, with a keypad next to it. Dr. Lawrence punched in a code, and the door creaked open, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Maria felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't hesitate. She approached the door quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to act fast before Dr. Lawrence disappeared into whatever hidden world lay beyond that door. Her fingers grazed the keypad as she examined the code. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been this nervous. The reality of what she was doing began to sink in. This wasn't just about a patient. This was about a massive secret, one that had the power to change everything. With trembling hands, Maria punched in the code. It wasn't perfect, but she'd seen Dr. Lawrence enter the numbers just seconds before. The door clicked open, and she slipped inside without a second thought. What she found inside left her breathless. The room was dimly lit, filled with strange advanced equipment. But in the center of it all was a bed, a hospital bed, just like the ones on the main floors. But this one was different. Lying in the bed, unconscious but very much alive, was none other than Mr. Blackwell. Maria's stomach lurched. What was he doing here? This wasn't just a hidden floor. It was a secret wing, one that no one outside of this small circle seemed to know about. This was a world far removed from the sterile, normal world of the hospital. It was a place for secrets, for things that couldn't see the light of day. But as Maria stepped closer to the bed, she saw something that nearly knocked the breath out of her. A large, complex device was attached to Mr. Blackwell's head. Wires and tubes connected him to the machine, and it seemed as though the device was feeding him something that had kept him in a coma all this time. What was going on here? Maria's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. She glanced over at the monitors next to the bed, which displayed all sorts of medical data: heart rate, oxygen levels, brain activity. But there was one thing that stood out: a large digital readout that flashed a single word in bold letters: Subject 001. This wasn't just a hospital. This was a research facility, a place where people were experimented on, used as subjects for something far darker than Maria could ever have imagined. And Mr. Blackwell was at the center of it all. Before she could react, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Panic surged through her as she spun around, but it was too late. Dr. Lawrence had caught her. "What do you think you're doing here?" His voice was cold, his eyes narrowing as he stepped into the room, blocking the door. "You shouldn't have come." Maria's mind raced for a way out, but her body froze in place. She was trapped. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking but determined. "Why is he here? What are you doing to him?" Dr. Lawrence's expression hardened. Mr. Blackwell is part of a much larger project, a project that could change the world. And now, so are you. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to say. This was more than she had ever bargained for. "You can't just leave, Maria," he continued. "You've seen too much now, and you're not going anywhere until we're ready for you." Maria's mind raced. Her thoughts scattered as she tried to think of a way out. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, and she instinctively reached for it, only to find a text from the same unknown number. "You're too deep now. It's too late to turn back. There's nowhere safe for you." She looked up at Dr. Lawrence, the cold reality of the situation settling in. He was right. There was no going back now. She had uncovered a secret that no one was meant to know, and it would take everything she had to survive what came next. As Dr. Lawrence took another step toward her, Maria realized one thing. She wasn't alone in this. There were others out there, people who had been fighting this battle long before she ever walked through the hospital doors. And no matter what it took, she was going to make sure their fight wasn't in vain.